The night my blood began to pool inside my body, the world narrowed to white lights and the steady panic of machines counting seconds I could no longer feel. I remember the smell of antiseptic, sharp and unforgiving, and the ceiling tiles sliding past as nurses rushed me through hallways that felt longer than my entire life. My hands shook not only from pain but from the weight of fear I had tried to hide for years. I had survived the crash, they said, but internal bleeding is a quiet enemy. Smiles while it steals time. Lying on that narrow bed, I thought about my twins first. They were only 3, still learning the shape of the world, still believing that their mother could fix anything with a hug and a promise. I imagined their shoes by the door, the small fingerprints on the refrigerator, the way they slept tangled together like they were afraid of being apart even in dreams. I was supposed to pick them up that evening. I was supposed to make dinner. I was supposed to be strong. Instead, I was bleeding under fluorescent lights, signing consent forms with a trembling hand. I reached for my phone because hope is stubborn. Even when you know better, it asks again. I called my parents because family is the word we use when we want to feel safe. I explained between shallow breaths that I needed help, that I was being prepared for surgery, that my children were waiting for someone who knew their bedtime songs. I told myself that this was the moment they would step forward, that the past would loosen its grip, that blood would mean something. What I received was not comfort. It was a familiar coldness, dressed as honesty. I was reminded of every time I had needed them before, every time they had counted my struggles as inconveniences. I was reduced to a problem to be managed, a weight they were tired of carrying. I learned that night how quickly love can be rescheduled when it competes with plans, how easily a daughter can become a burden when she asks for more than applause. The words cut deeper than the pain in my abdomen, because pain fades, but truth has a way of staying. When the call ended, the room felt larger and emptier at the same time. The beeping of the monitor became louder, as if it were mocking me, as if it were asking how much more I could lose before I broke. I stared at my phone, my reflection warped on the dark screen, and I finally let myself see what I had been pretending not to notice for years. I had been supporting them quietly, faithfully, month after month, like a secret penance. Mortgage payments, insurance bills, groceries. 8 years of help sent without ceremony, without thanks, because I believed that loyalty could heal old fractures. I believed that if I gave enough, I would earn a place that did not feel temporary. On that bed, with blood slipping away and time pressing closer, something inside me hardened into clarity. Survival has a way of stripping life down to what matters. I realized that I could not keep bleeding for people who refused to see me as human. I could not keep rescuing those who watched me drown. The decision formed without anger, without drama, just a quiet resolve that felt heavier than fear. I would stop. I would choose myself. I would choose my children. The doctors spoke in careful tones as they prepared me for surgery, explaining risks I already felt in my bones. I signed again, then again, because when your body is failing, paperwork becomes proof that you were here, that your name mattered to someone. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I thought about my grandfather. I thought about his hands, worn but steady, and the way he listened without judgment. I wondered if he would understand what my parents could not. I wondered if truth, spoken by the right voice, could still reach them. The anesthesia crept in like a tide, pulling me away from the noise, from the lights, from the hurt. My last thought before sleep took me was not of anger, but of balance. Of how much a person can give before there is nothing left to save. Somewhere beyond the swinging doors, my children waited. Somewhere else my parents made their choice. And somewhere, quietly, the truth was preparing to be spoken. I woke up as if from the bottom of a deep lake, lungs burning, mind slow and heavy. The first thing I felt was not pain but absence, a hollow awareness that something inside me had been cut, repaired, and rearranged while I was gone. The second was fear, sharp and immediate, crashing over me when I remembered why I was there. The surgery was over, the bleeding stopped, but survival never feels like victory at first. It feels like exhaustion dressed as relief. The room was dim, wrapped in the quiet hum of machines that now felt less threatening, almost protective. Every sound mattered. Every breath felt counted. I lay still, listening to my own heartbeat, steady but cautious, like it was unsure whether to trust the future. A nurse moved softly nearby, checking numbers, adjusting lines, offering reassurance with practiced calm. I nodded because nodding was easier than speaking, and because part of me was still floating between fear and gratitude. Time blurred in that room. Hours passed without shape, measured only by medication schedules and the slow return of sensation. In that haze, my phone rested on the bedside table like a silent witness. No missed calls. No messages asking if I was alive. I told myself not to look, but curiosity mixed with hope has always been my weakness. When I finally reached for it, my hand shook, not from pain this time, but from expectation. There was nothing from my parents. Not a question. Not a concern. The emptiness of the screen said more than any words ever could. Instead, I saw a message from my sister, light and careless. A picture of a crowded arena glowing with stage lights. A night of music and laughter, untouched by the reality that I had nearly disappeared. I closed the phone gently, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little composure I had left. That was when the past began to line up in my mind, like a jury that had finally reached a verdict. I remembered the first time I sent money, telling myself it was temporary. I remembered how temporary turned into routine. How routine turned into obligation. I remembered birthdays spent calculating transfers instead of candles. Holidays measured in receipts rather than memories. I had been present in their lives financially, but invisible in every other way. And still I kept giving because I thought endurance was the same as love. Lying there, stitched and weak, I opened my banking app with a clarity I had never felt before. There was no drama in the act, no trembling speeches, no revenge in my heart. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter had cost me enough. I cancelled the payments one by one. The mortgage, the insurance, the monthly support that had flowed for 8 years without question. Each confirmation felt like closing a door I had been holding open with my own body. For the first time in a long while I did not feel guilty. Felt light. Not happy, not yet, but unburdened in a way that made room for breath. I thought about my twins again, about the future I wanted for them, one where love was not something you had to buy, where family showed up when it mattered most. I promised myself that whatever strength I had left would be saved for them. Later that day, my grandfather came to see me. He moved slowly, his steps careful, but his presence filled the room more than any machine ever could. His eyes took in the bandages, the lines, the quiet aftermath of fear, and something in his expression tightened. He did not overwhelm me with questions. He simply sat beside the bed, his hand resting over mine, warm and solid, reminding me that some things endure. He stayed for a long time, listening as I spoke in pieces, as I let the truth spill without decoration. I told him everything, not as an accusation, but as a confession of how tired I was. He nodded, not surprised, only thoughtful, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. When he finally stood to leave, there was a resolve in his posture that I had not seen in years. As he walked out of the room, I watched his reflection fade in the glass of the door. I did not know then what he intended to do, or what words he would choose. I only knew that something had shifted. The bleeding had stopped, not just in my body, but in the quiet places of my life where I had been losing myself for far too long. Recovery teaches patience in the harshest way. Each day began with stiffness and ended with the same quiet ache. A reminder that healing is not a straight line but a slow negotiation with your own limits. I learned to sit up again, then to stand, then to walk a few careful steps as if the floor itself might give way. The doctors were satisfied with my progress, but progress does not erase what has been seen. My body was mending, yet my heart was still sorting through the wreckage of that night. When I was finally discharged, the world outside the hospital felt too loud, too fast. Sunlight pressed against my eyes like an accusation, as if it were asking why I had ever doubted my worth. My grandfather drove me home in silence, the kind that does not need to be filled. Every familiar street looked different, not because it had changed but because I had. Survival rearranges your priorities, stripping away illusions you once protected. At home, my twins ran to me with the force of unfiltered love. Their arms wrapped around my legs, small and fierce, grounding me in a way no medication ever could. In that moment, the last traces of fear loosened their grip. I held them carefully, aware of my stitches, aware of my fragility, and aware that this was the reason I was still here. The house was imperfect and loud and real, and for the first time in years it felt enough. Few days later the messages began. At first they were subtle, polite inquiries masked as concern. Then they sharpened into confusion, then irritation, then disbelief. The support had stopped, and the silence I had accepted for so long suddenly became inconvenient for them. I read each notification without responding, observing how quickly attention arrives when comfort is threatened. There was a strange calm in not explaining myself, in letting the truth exist without my defense. What I did not know was that my grandfather had gone to see them. He did not announce it to me, nor did he seek permission. He carried the truth the way he always had, without embellishment, without fear. He sat across from my parents in the home they had kept with my help, and he spoke with the authority of a man who had lived long enough to recognize patterns. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply laid the years out in front of them, one by one, until there was nowhere left to look but inward. He reminded them of who I had been before responsibility aged me too quickly. He reminded them of the money they had accepted, the sacrifices they had ignored, the daughter they had reduced to a transaction. He told them about the hospital, about the bleeding, about the children who needed someone when they chose entertainment instead. Each word landed with weight, because truth spoken calmly is heavier than anger ever could be. When my grandfather returned, his face was tired but resolved. He did not repeat every detail, only enough for me to understand that the conversation had been unavoidable. There was a pause between us, filled with years of unspoken loyalty. He told me that some people do not realize the cost of their actions until the bill is placed directly in front of them. Even then, understanding is not guaranteed. That night, alone in my room, I reflected on how easily roles can reverse. How the one who gives becomes the one expected to bleed, and how quickly entitlement grows in the absence of gratitude. I felt sadness but not regret. I had chosen boundaries over approval, truth over tradition. The silence that followed was not empty. It was honest. Outside, the house settled into sleep. Inside, I allowed myself to rest without guilt for the first time in years. Whatever came next, I knew it would be built on something real. Not obligation, not fear, but the quiet strength that comes from finally standing still and refusing to be pushed back into the dark. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, subtle at first, then heavier, as if the truth my grandfather had spoken was still echoing through rooms I was no longer in. My parents reached out again, this time not with anger, but with something that tried to resemble concern. The words were careful, measured, shaped to sound reasonable. I read them slowly, noticing what was missing. There were no apologies. No acknowledgement of the night I almost died. Only questions about money, framed as worry, as if love could still be negotiated. I did not answer right away. Healing had taught me that silence can be a response, and sometimes the most powerful one. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the rhythm of my life. I attended follow-up appointments, cooked simple meals, learned how to rest without feeling lazy. Each ordinary moment felt like an act of rebellion against the version of myself that believed exhaustion was proof of worth. I was learning how to live without constantly earning my place. My grandfather checked on me often. He never pushed me toward forgiveness or distance. He trusted me to find the balance on my own. One afternoon, as we sat together watching my children play, he spoke quietly about responsibility and love, about how family should be a shelter, not a storm. He reminded me that kindness does not mean surrender, and that protecting your children sometimes requires disappointing your parents. His words settled into me, steady and sure, like a truth I could finally stand on. Meanwhile, the reality my parents had avoided began to close in. Bills did not pause out of nostalgia. Comfort does not sustain itself on memories. The life they had grown used to demanded attention, and without my quiet support, cracks began to show. I was not told everything, but enough reached me to understand that consequences had arrived, not as punishment but as a mirror. For the first time, they were forced to see what I had been carrying alone. What surprised me was not their struggle, but my response to it. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel revenge. I felt distance, the kind that allows clarity. Their difficulties were no longer mine to solve, and that realization came with an unexpected peace. I had mistaken sacrifice for love for too long. Now I understood that love, real love, does not demand self-erasure. As weeks passed, my strength returned. The scars faded from angry red to quiet lines, reminders of both fragility and survival. I returned to work slowly, rearranged my schedule around my children, and built a life that did not revolve around managing someone else's comfort. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I looked lighter, steadier, as if I had finally put something down. Then, one evening, a message arrived that was different. It was short, stripped of explanations, and for the first time, it did not ask for anything. It acknowledged the past without naming it, and it carried a weight that suggested realization had begun, even if too late. I did not rush to reply. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to be flung open again. They are meant to be approached slowly, with caution and truth. As I put my phone away, I looked at my children sleeping peacefully down the hall. Their future felt wide and unwritten. I knew that whatever happened next, I would not return to who I had been before the hospital, before the bleeding, before my grandfather spoke the truth that could no longer be ignored. Time has a way of finishing conversations that words cannot. Months passed, then more, and life continued without the drama I once feared would follow my decision. The world did not collapse because I stopped giving until it hurt. Instead, it became quieter, more stable, more honest. I learned that peace is not loud, does not announce itself, simply stays. My parents and I spoke again eventually. Not often, not deeply, but with a distance that felt intentional rather than cold. They knew now that the dynamic had changed, that I was no longer the silent solution to problems they did not want to face. The power of that realization did not come from confrontation, but from consistency. I did not bend. I did not explain myself repeatedly. I lived differently, and that was explanation enough. My grandfather remained the steady center of it all. He never took credit for what he had done, never framed himself as a hero. But I saw the impact of his truth in the way the air shifted when his name was mentioned, in the way certain excuses were no longer used so freely. He had spoken not to wound, but to reveal, and revelation has a permanence that anger never achieves. There are moments, even now, when I think back to that hospital bed. To the lights, the fear, the realization that I could have been gone without closure or justice. I no longer feel bitterness when I remember it. Feel clarity. That night stripped my life down to its essentials and asked me a question I could no longer avoid. Who was I willing to bleed for? And who was I willing to walk away from to survive? The answer lives in my home, in the laughter of my children, in the routines we built from scratch. It lives in the boundaries I keep, the rest I allow myself, the love I give without bargaining. I am no longer afraid of being called difficult or ungrateful. I know now that those labels are often placed on people who finally stop accepting less than they deserve. I used to believe family was defined by obligation, by endurance, by how much pain you could tolerate without leaving. I was wrong. Family is revealed in crisis. It is measured by who shows up when it is inconvenient, who stays when there is nothing to gain. That truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. I survived more than a surgery. I survived the moment I realized that being needed is not the same as being loved. And when my grandfather spoke the truth that night, he did not just change how my parents saw me. He changed how I saw myself. I stopped bleeding for approval, and in doing so, I finally began to live.